Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox Podcast. Today we are talking about the best way to study for the bar exam if you are a visual learner. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today we are talking about how to study best for the bar exam if you are a visual learner. So Allison, what does it mean to be a visual learner?
Well, as someone who is definitely a visual learner.
That was a nice punt to you for this one. I was like, since you are a visual learner, why don't you explain
Yeah,
it to
so
us?
I'm actually a very visual learner. I mean, it's probably not an accident that I went to architecture school. So I've been trained in design and all these very visual media that, probably doesn't immediately seem relevant to law school or the bar exam. But the reality is, if you're a visual learner, things like images, pictures, color, and other types of visual media really work best to help you learn and memorize. So for me, people would laugh at me in law school because I would spend time drawing pictures, or I'd spend time coloring my notes or doing these really detailed colored flowcharts. And, it wasn't what worked for other people, but it was what worked for me.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of in the middle. I'm like a little visual and like a little auditory. I kind of float in between the middle, but you are definitely much more visual than I am. I've seen what you did in law school.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to realize too that, you're not one or the other typically.
Right.
Everyone combines all of these different ways to learn. And so one of the things when you're thinking about in terms of studying for the bar is, A, you're allowed to play to your strengths, and you probably should, but it also might depend what type of information you're working with, whether it's a certain topic or a certain subject matter area. Certain areas lend themselves more or less to certain types of learning. So,
right.
Just because you think, oh, I'm a visual learner, doesn't mean you always have to be doing drawings. You always have to be doing diagrams or maybe other things that work just fine.
Yeah, that's true. So there are ways that you can figure out if you're a visual learner. There are some online tests that you can take, which we will link to in the show notes. But I think it's also important to think about maybe your experience in law school. Were reading and writing really your academic strengths? Were you easily distracted in class when people were talking by like looking out the window or looking around at what others are doing around you?
Oh my gosh, other people's laptops were the worst for me. I literally had to basically sit in the front row because looking at what other people were doing on their laptops was incredibly distracting.
Yeah. And I think it behooves you to really think through this stuff going into your bar prep, because no matter how you decide to prepare, whether you're doing a big commercial course or you're studying on your own, you want to be very conscious about where you are studying and how you're spending your time. So if you work well in libraries or really quiet spaces where you're not going to be so distracted, then, that's also something to be very cognizant of. And, that also might mean that your learning style kind of leans towards this visual learner learning style.
Yeah, for me too, I can study in a quiet library, but I'm also a person who can study and actually quite effectively in a place with a little bit more background. So, I actually study really well in a coffee shop, for example, with a lot of ambient noise. That might drive other people crazy. For me, I don't know. It's weird. I remember one time I was studying, I think at that tea place we used to go all the time before it shut.
Samovar, yeah.
Samovar in San Francisco. They have these big glass windows, and I thought, I really need to focus. I'm going to turn my attention away from the window and really focus. And I found myself actually getting really anxious. And I was like, why is this happening? And I turned around and just the passersby and the kind of background stuff was enough to somehow calm my brain down. So I don't know, it's weird, but I think the point is, this is the bar exam. You can do whatever works for you. Nobody cares how you prepare.
Yeah. And I'm definitely one of those people who is better off in the quiet room of the library where I don't see a lot of other people working or especially if it's the type of studying that's something that's not particularly interesting to me. I mean, if it's something that I'm interested and engaged in, I can basically do that work anywhere. But the bar exam is pretty boring sometimes. Yeah. Let's just be honest.
But I mean, I spent a lot of time studying for the bar exam in coffee shops, actually.
Yeah.
Because I was going crazy just sitting in my house alone.
Yeah. I definitely I don't like to study at home. I like to go somewhere to, a library or some place where it's away from home. So it's just really important to think about your triggers. What are your distraction triggers? What makes it easy for you to focus and embrace that? Because you don't want to waste your study time when you're on the bar exam. I think that's pretty important.
Right. And also, you don't need to make it harder than it needs to be.
Yeah.
So for example, if you're a visual learner, probably seeing the material is going to help you learn it. So that you're not just going to sit and listen to someone tell you about this. And I noticed this in my Spanish class. If my tutor just tells me something and he thinks that he's explaining it, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I understand the subjunctive. And then it basically leaves my head as soon as I leave the room. Right. But if I sit down and write things out, even if it's the exact same stuff he told me aloud, or even words, I just need to see them written, and then it sticks better in my brain. So if that's you, play to that strength. And you might, we're going to offer a lot of different recommendations soon, but one of them is really just writing things down.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I was memorizing things for the bar exam, I would write my own kind of condensed handwritten outlines because it was easier to memorize something that I created. Mm-hmm. And even though it didn't have any amazing content to it, there was just something about that little bit of, it came from my brain, it came out of my hand, and that I can visualize those outlines in a way that I couldn't something that was handed to me. So, that became a really good use of my study time.
Right. And I think also you can think about ways, say, for example, when you say you visualize it, some people, for example, will use a different color font when they are looking at distinctions. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at, the California versus the federal rules of evidence or professional responsibility, whatever it is, if you're consistent in the way that you use a font color, you might literally see that on the exam and be like, oh, that's red. Okay, I know that that's California. Yeah. Whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And it's likely in your outlines in law school that you played with some of these ideas. Unless you weren't successful in law school, then you may want to explore new ideas. But
right, because I think sometimes there's pressure in law school if you are a visual learner, which is probably not the most common learning style. There's pressure to do these massive outlines that you type on the computer, and you may have found that didn't work for you so well, but you also may have felt pressure to continue doing it. So. Mm-hmm. If you found a different approach that really worked better, definitely go for it. And if not, here's a great time to explore.
Yeah, because nobody knows how you study for the bar exam, just that you pass or fail.
No one cares.
Nobody cares.
Don't care.
Nobody cares. All right, so let's go through some kind of specific recommendations. We've already started talking a little bit about outlines, but definitely having some sort of written document is one option that you want to look at. So this could be, a condensed outline that you've created from either some of your classes that you took, although I think studying off of some canned bar materials can be better because the substantive material that can be tested on the bar exam can be different than what your professors chose to cover. So it's probably a good idea to use some material from some reputable bar source as an outline to start with, especially if you're not going to use one of the big commercial providers.
Right, I think that's right. I mean, you've got to start someplace, but I think making that your own as quickly as possible and really condensing it and maybe using colors or arrows or whatever it is to link this stuff together is just going to help you learn it a lot faster.
Yeah, or handwriting, always my favorite. Handwriting because I like that you can draw arrows and use colors.
Yeah. I really feel like if you're a visual learner, you almost certainly should be handwriting your outlines.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably a really good idea. I still have, I was just going through my bookcase the other day and I found my bar binder with all my handwritten outlines in it that I've moved a zillion times since the bar exam, which was many years ago at this point. But I think it's really, now I feel like I can't get rid of it. I mean, it's just not worth anything. It's totally outdated, but
I have a bunch of stuff for my 1L classes and I'll tell you what, actually they're still useful.
Totally.
I'm like, if you make I did an amazing flow chart that I made in contracts and in 3 pages I covered the entire subject.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I could do a pretty decent contracts analysis if you put that in front of me. It's like, it's simplified, and it tells you what questions to ask and shows you some resources if you need to go back to a section of the code or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a great flowchart. There's no reason to throw it away.
Yeah. I also had a lot of success around outlines to memorizing like lists, like writing out lists, if coming up with basically like, let's say around hearsay, you have a list of all the hearsay exceptions, and then it was easier. And sometimes I'd have a mnemonic for them. Sometimes I could just memorize the first letter. Like if it was just a order, like an A, A, C, B, I don't know why I could memorize that, but tell me your name. And I'm like, what's your name? But I found that I could memorize lists in that way and easily recreate them. So you also want to think about ways that you can condense this material down into some easily recallable forms. And I think that that's important to play with as well when you're making these materials for yourself, because you want them to be in such a way that they make sense to your brain, and then you can recall that information.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you want, if you get a question about evidence, it's great if you can just immediately write down a very, very brief list of the hearsay exceptions, and then you're like, oh, okay, I know what to look for.
Right.
Something like that, you're like, it's pretty likely to show up. I mean, obviously, you probably can't do this for every single legal rule, but for, the major legal rules that you're almost certain if a subject matter comes up will probably come up, like, what are the degrees of homicide?
Right.
That kind of thing. Like, that's pretty likely to appear in a crim law essay.
Yeah, even I was able to memorize an overall structure for contracts, which was kind of like my attack plan for contracts. So basically all the potential issues that could come up in contracts. I basically like had this sketched outline that I did on my scratch paper, so I could go through and just be like, yes, talk about, no, talk about, yes, talk about, no, talk about. And it was very helpful when you're kind of in a question and you're scratching your head a little bit going like, what are all these possible issues? And you can just quickly go through, check the ones that apply, and then you have your organization right there.
Yeah, exactly. And, there are lots of condensed outlines that you can start with too. One thing I would warn people about if you are a very visual learner is sometimes the level of abbreviations can be maddening.
Yeah.
And, for me, like, I just couldn't stand abbreviations because they looked bad to me, or they just looked weird. My brain just didn't like them. So, I'd have to write out everything. So if you look at something like Lean Sheets, which has a lot of great information, but you might look at it and be like, too many abbreviations. But then you can use that to make your own. You're allowed to write out the words. It's fine.
And what I think a lot of people don't think about when they get a tool like Lean Sheets is if there's a section of one subject that is too condensed or has too many abbreviations or something like that, you can just work on that one section. I think sometimes people get into this idea that if they start, oh, the section's too condensed, so I need to redo the whole outline. And I don't think that's a great use of your time. You should just be evaluating and saying like, okay, I like the way they did this, but this isn't enough for me. So you expand it, you take another sheet of paper, you put it behind that one and with a note to yourself, and then that's how you do it. I mean, don't recreate the wheel for stuff that's already working, but make sure you're spending time creating your own materials so that it can be meaningful for you.
Right. And also a lot of this material, ideally, you probably already know.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at something like, torts or contracts, like you've studied this before, you probably know a lot of the material. And there are only certain areas that you're going to really need to brush up on. And those are what you need to focus on, not the places where you're already pretty solid.
Yeah. So outside of these kind of outlines we've been talking about, you can also create diagrams and visual images, which some of the diagrams and flowcharts you were talking about. And this is something you used a lot in law school and for the bar. The nice thing about these types of materials is they're very free form. So you can do flowcharts with pictures or symbols or graphics. You can even do them on, white paper without lines, so you don't feel constrained by the lines.
Oh my God, there's no way I couldn't. You absolutely could not have paper with lines on it. If you're no way, no, definitely not. No.
Well, what's funny? My high school math tutor, when I was in high school, I think it was for pre-calculus or something like that, but she was dead set on the fact that you could not use paper with lines to do math. She was like, that's the worst thing in the world. You need no lines. So you have free form thinking. You need to be able to cross things out, and you can't have these constraints when doing math. It was really
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to that, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, another way that can work for people is something like whiteboarding. Anytime I have to do something challenging, I almost always get out the whiteboard. And, this sounds crazy, but it is actually, you need to think about what kind of paper you're using.
Yeah.
We like our Circa notebooks, and one of the advantages there is that they have lined paper, they have unlined paper. And it doesn't sound like it would matter, but like it would really bother me to actually draw a flowchart on paper that had lines on it. Like I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. And I have had students who have been able to use whiteboards to create some visual representations for themselves. And then that is something that they can memorize and reference back. You and I have also used those poster boards that are like Post-its.
Yep.
I've had students in the past do those, and then they actually, like, if they have a room in their house that they're studying in or something, sometimes they'll put some of those attack plans and things on the wall using those Post-its.
No, you could do like a whole wall of Post-it notes. I've seen people do that before. Anything you can move around like that, I feel like can be effective for a visual learner.
And if anybody, go ahead.
I was saying, because part of it's like you start to feel constrained by things like a typed outline because you just can't see everything at once.
Yeah. If somebody does an amazing collage of flowcharts on their wall, will you please take a picture and send it to us? That would be amazing. Please. We won't necessarily publish it. It would just make us really happy.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there's something about that ability to move things around and look at them in relation to each other that can be really effective. I mean, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll work out a problem or work out an area on something like a whiteboard and then basically preserve it for later by making, say, a more traditional outline or something. But there's something about the way that like your brain is working usually where you need to like be able to see the pieces and move them around to really understand how they relate to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, the outline form can be very constraining and can be frustrating. And if you're feeling frustrated by that, like abandon it, move away.
Yeah, just get rid of it. You don't need it.
Exactly.
It's fine.
Yeah. I do think with bar study though, we were talking about using colors to create, to map distinctions and things like that. If you do have some sort of colors coding scheme, I think that's wise. So as you visually memorize things, you remember that distinctions are in red or something like that. So you don't, do one set of outlines or flowcharts where distinctions are red and the next time they're green and the next time they're blue. I don't think that you want that inconsistency. I think you want to decide this is how I'm going to do this kind of consistently throughout all my bar materials, even if they don't all look the same. They can have some of that formatting to trigger your memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like structure too. I had a certain way that I structured my handwritten outlines with, a box around the key topic area, and then I would color it in, stuff like that, which people think is a total waste of time, let me tell you. But it's not, because that's how you're making sense of the material, and it's also how you're going to be able to recall it later.
Yeah.
And if it works for you, it works for you, and do not listen to what anyone else says.
No. If anybody thinks your outlines look crazy, it doesn't matter. As long as you're memorizing the material, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I would do like drawings. For example, my 1L torts class, we had to memorize, say, 30 cases. And I did little drawings of each one. And people were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're drawing. Like, this is law school. And I'm like, okay, can you tell me from this case name what this case is about? Because I can glance at this and tell you exactly what it's about.
Right. Totally. Yeah, it's like, who's judgy now?
Yeah, like, well, okay, you do you, do whatever you want. But like, this is actually pretty effective.
Yep. You can also consider connecting visual images or diagrams to real life examples and use those in your notes. So it could be drawing a picture, but it also could be reminding yourself of like a story, something you saw in the news. I mean, if you're studying,
oh my gosh, you could do like a vision board. You could get out your magazines and like tear up, whatever you need, your Vogue.
It's true. Yeah. So things that you remember from class, if your professor had a really compelling way to talk about a rule from class or real life examples. But anytime you can come up with these kind of like visual connections from these stories or real life examples, you're more likely to put this information more into your long-term memory. And that's going to be significant because although there are a lot of people who say, well, just memorize all your material in the last couple of weeks of the bar exam, there's a lot to memorize. If you can push some of this stuff into your brain before that, that's all the better. All the better.
Right. And also, you can think about things like spaced repetition. So you start trying to memorize pretty far in advance, but you make sure that once a week or every few days, you're kind of going back to the things that you already know. And that's going to get that much deeper into your memory than something that you've only tried to memorize once a week before the test.
Yeah, exactly. And if you struggle with anxiety at all, you don't want to leave that memorization to the end, because as your anxiety goes up, your information retention often goes down. And so that can be very, very, very triggering. So you want to move that prep to be slow and steady wins the race. So you're not cramming at the end, because it's not going to help you feel confident going into the test.
Right. And memorization is one of those things that tends to trigger anxiety in almost everyone. So if that is something you're prone to, just know it's going to be even worse.
Yes. Something else we've written about on the blog as well, that I know students have used, is memory palaces.
Oh, love the memory palace.
Yeah, why don't you talk to us about what the memory palace is? It's a great name, no matter what.
Right. In fact, one of my architecture school professors actually wrote a book called Chambers for a Memory Palace, but I'm not exactly sure it has that much to do with this. But it's a good book. It's very interesting. So the idea here, and this is actually something that people have used for hundreds, if not thousands of years, this is what the people who are telling the story of the Odyssey out loud back in the day were using to remember everything. Basically, you create a three-dimensional space, and then you imagine yourself in that space, whether you're walking through it, whether you're moving things around, whether you're just looking. And so objects can take on, some aspect of a rule or something like that you need to memorize. One of the companies, I guess, that does this sort of thing is the Sketchy Law. Yeah. I'm like Smart Law. No, Sketchy Law. Sketchy Law. So they have actually sort of created some of these for you for various topics. And if it sounds interesting, I think they can be extremely useful.
Yeah. I mean, you can use other folks' memory palaces, or you can come up with your own to memorize a lot of this material. And so, there can be lots of examples. So here's like one idea, that you're studying the statute of frauds, and you might imagine that you're nervous, and so your legs are bouncing up and down.
Or you might actually be nervous.
And so you remember that contracts fall under the statute of frauds because your legs bouncing up and down. You think of the "my legs won't stop bouncing." So every time you see statute of frauds, that's what you have this image about "my legs won't stop bouncing," and then you can remember that, M is for marriage, Y is for contracts greater than a year, L is for land, sales of land contracts, E is for executive contracts, and G is for guarantee contracts. Lastly, sales is for the sales of goods of $500 or more. And you could also associate different parts of your legs with each type of contract. You could be like holding something while you're bouncing that had more meaning. But you can get a little creative to trigger this image that can allow you to organize this information in your head without just having to like recall some random list.
Right, because if you're like, okay, what are the requirements of the statute of frauds? It's like, I have no idea. Yeah. But if you're like, okay, my legs, like, okay, that. But even that, you're like, maybe I won't remember that part. But then when you link it to that memory of a physical action, it's like, okay, the statute of frauds, my leg was moving. Oh, yeah, right. My legs. Okay, the M is blah, blah, blah. It's actually pretty powerful.
Yeah. And this is something you might have to play with a little bit to get in the groove for yourself about what will work for you. But I think using this imagery is very powerful when you're trying to remember things. And people who memorize a lot for a living have to come up with these tricks to memorize orders of things. It's not just, it's not just people studying for the bar exam. It's singers memorizing songs, just think about all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, think about how much more context a three-dimensional image that you imagine walking in has than just a list on a page.
Right.
This is one of our tutors came up with. I don't know if they came up with it, but I think they read an article, it sounds like, Moonwalking Through the Bar Exam, which talks about a book called Moonwalking with Einstein on how to use these techniques. So this one's a little crazy, but just to give you an example.
That's right.
All right. So imagine your childhood bedroom. Are we all there?
Yes.
Okay. Now in that bedroom, imagine stand-up comedian Richard Pryor in a jail cell watching a movie screen wearing a perfectly tailored red suit. You can almost envision him waving a sparkling magic wand in one hand and holding Sigmund Freud's severed head in the other. this point, you're probably like, what are we talking about? Yeah, so the explanation, which may or may not work for you, but apparently worked for the person who wrote this, is that the prior restraint is Richard prior restraint in a jail cell, restrained, is the advanced screening, the movie screen of speech, which is disfavored unless the law is narrowly tailored, so that's his perfectly tailored suit, to a compelling, magic wands compel action, or at least significant, Sigmund Freud. That one's the one I'd probably have to forget. Government interest. But, whatever. If Sigmund Freud doesn't work for you, it could be your significant other.
Yeah.
The point is not that you memorize this particular one. The point is that, already you're imagining like, oh, okay, I know more about prior restraints and maybe I'll actually remember this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And anytime you have like something to trigger things in your brain like that, it's amazing the amount of retention you can have. So I'm sitting here like with this image and like I'm remembering that image, that
now
we
I'm
just
like,
conjured
Richard
up.
Pryor in the jail cell. Okay,
Yeah.
Prior restraint, got it.
And you can also think that outside of memorizing these kind of techniques, I mean, visualization to train your brain to do things is used in like hypnosis therapy and a lot of different, guided meditations and things like that.
Olympic athletes,
like, the idea that you're connecting your thoughts or your memories to these sort of visual representations is really critical. And it's something that's so common. I was watching the Olympics back for the Winter Olympics. And if you watch the skiers do the visualization before they go down the runs. I don't know. Did you see any of this? I don't know how much of the Olympics you got to see. But
I did see, actually. I saw, I didn't see this particular part.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, they're standing there and they have like you can't see if their eyes are closed because they've got like goggles and stuff on. But they're standing there with their bodies and they are from memory doing the run. And the runs aren't very long. So you can see they're like doing the turns and they've got the run memorized. And it's really impressive when you think about it, that they are able to visualize the entire run before they do it. And I was like, wow, that's a very specific memory that they have had to implant in their brain pretty quickly because they may have done a couple of training runs on those runs.
Well, and I think, interestingly enough, I think some of the runs, actually, they were not even allowed training runs.
That's true. Yes.
They had literally never skied this course before, and they're trying to imagine themselves skiing it based on other information, and then they go out there and execute. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, they were getting reports on the course from other people who'd gone down it, and then they were imagining the visualization. Pretty amazing stuff. So the more you can play with your brain about how you best recall this information, and what's worked for you in the past, could really make or break your bar prep. I mean, for me, I used to do a lot of singing. I don't know how I still have whole entire songs memorized from being like 16.
Well, that's the thing too. Imagine like all the songs that are in your brain from your lifetime that you have made basically no effort in many cases to remember.
Yeah.
And all the words, all the tune, you can sing it from memory.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I could still do like my entire a cappella CD from memory. I don't know why I still remember all that stuff from like college. It's crazy. College was a long time ago. And I still can memorize these or have memorized this amazing amount of volume of information. So I think we oftentimes shortchange ourselves when we're thinking about retaining information, that we can't do it because we don't retain a lot of information in our daily lives. But I think if you really go into your brain, you actually do have a lot of information retained. So it's about how can you learn this information in the same way that you're able to retain other information.
I think that's right. I mean, for a simple example, say that you've purchased a commercial bar course and you're thinking, oh, do I want to listen to this, listen to the lectures while I'm at the gym, or do I want to watch them? Well, if you're a visual learner, you probably want to watch them and not just listen, because you're going to probably retain, 50% more information just seeing it. So things like that, just thinking about, okay, I need to sit down and watch this. And there are different tools. We mentioned Sketchy Law, which I think is pretty amazing. I watched one of them just to review it, and I still think I remember like parts of it years later. And Adaptabar has like a lot of stuff that explains complex law in a very visual way. So, look at these different tools and really think about what's going to work for you. Yeah.
And the one thing about Sketchy Law is they focus, at least right now at the time of this recording, on the 7 MBE subjects, but that still can be a good chunk of material that you can review in this way and adopt as your own. And I think everybody on our team who's reviewed these videos has the same response of like, really, do they work? And then like a little later, because I think they also do it to like music. You're like bopping along to the tune or whatever, and you're realizing you remember things while you're doing laundry or something completely unrelated, and then you're like, wow, maybe this stuff does actually work. So you can play with this idea, and again, it's knowing that you don't have to learn everything the exact same way for every subject, but you can pull these things in for different subjects that have meaning for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, if you are a very visual learner, we'll give you the caveat on watching a bunch of lectures. If you're not benefiting from just watching a lecture where someone's explaining the law to you, just stop.
Yeah.
You're probably going to be spending your time better if you get the book on the topic and read the book and make your own handwritten outline. Just because chances are good, that's a more efficient way for your brain to actually learn this material.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. There's this idea that because most of the bar review providers provide 20 hours or more a week of lectures, that is the proven way for everybody to retain this law. And that is not the case for a lot of people. So
no, I mean, I looked at this schedule for one of these. I was like, you've got to be joking. Like, I'm not going to do this. And so I didn't watch a single bar lecture, and I passed 2 bar exams. So, know it works.
Yeah. And I did sit through all those lectures because I'm definitely a rule follower, but, but I will say that I would go to the library, we'd listen to these lectures in the morning and we'd go to the library after lunch, and it dawned on me that I had not retained anything from those lectures. And so I really had to I would create my own outlines in the afternoon. It never dawned on me at that point that I would be better off not going to the lectures.
Yeah, you could have just skipped it.
Because you and I weren't friends yet. You would have been like, why are you going to the lectures?
If you're not retaining anything, use those 3 hours to sleep in and go have a sandwich.
Exactly.
What's the point?
I know. I needed more Allison Monahan in my life back then. But I think I even knew that it wasn't working for me. I think I was just fortunate that I was able to still study that material on my own and make it work, where I don't think if I was to evaluate that bar prep experience now, I would choose to spend so much of my study time, because 20 some hours a week.
It's a long time.
It's a lot of time to review substantive material if you are doing it in a way that's going to help you retain it.
Yeah. So, I mean, along with, making your materials, I think reviewing these things, figuring out what do you know, what do you not know, testing yourself, all of these things are what you need to do to have a much more active approach to bar study, which is much more likely to let you pass than just being like, well, I clocked my 20 hours, so I'm good.
Exactly. And it's pretty common knowledge in the study of how people learn that you have to see things in repetition before you can retain it. So some people say 7 times, but you need to see it over and over again. So you can't just say, okay, check, I know con law, and then come back to it 6 weeks later and go, why don't I know con law anymore? That's not how it works.
Yeah, but also con law is something you've studied before. I mean, some of these topic areas you will never have seen before. In California, a lot of people, for example, have not taken community property.
Right.
So that's probably something that, regardless of what your bar schedule says, you want to start studying earlier so that you can keep dipping into it. Maybe you watch the lecture on that because it's a topic you don't know anything about. And then you make your outline, and then you review your outline, and you do some practice problems, and you realize what you don't know, and you do some more, and maybe you make a flow chart or whatever it is. I mean, that's a topic that would be super visual. I can already visualize like piles of money or a house split down the middle, whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. And there's like a nice flow about you need to look at the source of the funds, then you need to see if they did anything to change the nature of the funds. And then, it's like, and then do you have any presumptions? I mean, there's a great flow.
Imagine money setting on fire and turning into ashes, all these things are going to help you remember this topic that maybe you don't actually really have that much familiarity with, even by the time you take the bar.
Yeah, that's true. I also think, we talk a lot about practice on this podcast, and every podcast we do, about the importance of practice when you're studying for any of these significant tests. And I think that one of the things that visual learners can also get a lot of benefit, well, everybody can get a benefit, but visual learners specifically can get a benefit about writing out answers, is the rewrite process. That if you are missing something, or you didn't learn the law in the correct way and you missed the law after you've evaluated your work, you can go back and do rewriting to make corrections and fix the law. And then it's possible through that practice, you are reinforcing the correct law and then you are putting it into your memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the pros of being a visual learner in an area, like law that doesn't really reward it so much is that you're going to be really great at like structuring your outline or structuring your essays and things like that. So, headers, not a problem. Of course you want headers. They just look good.
Right.
And also, in terms of planning your outline and things like that, I think, again, this is where you have a real strength because you can do a quick handwritten drawing that's going to contain, pack in a lot of information just because that's the way your brain works. For me, I would always have, assuming that they let me take it to the bar, but, usually I would have a red pen and a blue pen. And for example, the law might always be blue. And then the facts I was going to use were always red. And then I had a black pen, which is where I basically did the structure of the outline.
Right.
Simple, but it was really easy to see at a glance what facts I needed to use and what law I was planning to use and how it all fit together.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing to think about when you're doing these practice tests, especially for essays, is utilize your scratch paper. You have the ability to create these visual representations for yourself about what you're going to write about. So like anytime you're getting stuck, anytime that you are, struggling, go to your visual place. Scratch papers typically don't have lines, so Allison will be very happy about scratch paper without lines.
Well, and you can also, I had certain strategies for marking up the hypo, for example. So, when I read through it the first time, I would typically like underline things that jumped out at me just very lightly. And then when I went back the second time for like a really careful read, once I understood the question, I would be highlighting the key facts with a highlighter. And so, I had this consistent formula. And then oftentimes when I used a fact, I would cross it off, so I had this visual way of looking at the question itself that it jumped out if I had for some reason forgotten to use a certain fact. It was obvious. It wasn't crossed off. It was highlighted.
Yeah, exactly.
But you got to practice that in advance. Don't just try it on exam day.
No, these are habits. In order to create a habit, you have to do something like a lot of times, like over 25 times, or some people say 28 times.
Every practice essay you've done.
Every practice essay. You can't be coming up with new strategies the day of the bar exam. So
don't pick your colors well in advance.
Exactly. So other things to avoid if you are a visual learner is oftentimes studying with others may not work for you because you really have to do the hands-on work yourself. Visual distractions. Oh, well, this is bad for everybody, but TV screens.
Oh my God.
Social media.
Nothing I hate more than having a TV on in the background.
Yeah. Your phone, put your phone in your bag. There was a time when we didn't have cell phones and it was okay.
We lived.
We did. So
people communicated.
We did. We survived. So really try and just put things away so you can focus in, like you were telling the story about studying at the tea house, turn away from the street so you're not distracted by the cars going by. Just be very conscious of what's triggering for you and try and, regroup and make those small changes to make the most out of your study time.
Yeah, and I think too, for me, one of the key things was always I had to have earplugs if I was at the bar exam because the visual clutter really bothered me. The auditory clutter really bothered me. I needed to be able to focus on what was actually in front of me.
Mm-hmm. And some bar exams open up. I know they do this in California, and I'm not sure about some other states, but they will have a day where they open up registration, and based on the order in which you register is the order in which you get assigned a seat. So they actually told us about this in law school. And so they opened registration at midnight, some night. I don't remember. But a bunch of us went on because you're in law school and you're up at midnight, on at midnight and registered. And then we were in the first couple rows of a room that at a convention center that had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I think for a lot of us, it was much less distracting to only see 4 rows in front of you, 4 laptops in front of you, than the thousands of people in front of you. So you can even think about how you can possibly manipulate the test taking situation to allow you to have less visual distractions, because it was less distracting only having a few rows of people in front of you.
Yeah, weirdly enough, I always preferred being in the back of the room for a test.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, weird.
In law school, I was always in the middle, but on an end because I didn't like.
I had to be in the aisle. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't like that climb.
It's like the airplane. I was like, I want to be able to get out.
I know.
Not be trapped.
I know. I did the same thing on an airplane. And what was funny is I actually got on an aisle for the bar exam too. That was just luck of the draw. I know. All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. But I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. One thing I want to mention is if you are someone who has trouble coming up with some of these options to help yourself study, I think this is a good opportunity where a tutor can be very effective because your tutor can help you suss out what's actually working for you and not working for you and brainstorming different strategies. And if you need that to be successful, that might be something you want to explore. So just something to think about. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and a rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.